Good afternoon, viewers. I am Shankar Kumar. I teach history at Hindu College in Delhi University, and welcome to this series of lectures on European history. And today, the topic that we would be talking about pertains to what we know as Reformation in Europe. And as students of history would know, or even otherwise people would know, Reformation pertains to efforts made around 16th century in Europe to reform, to bring about some positive changes in the Catholic Church. Now, as we will see in the course of this discussion for half an hour, basically we would be talking of the broad contours of Reformation. So, it would essentially be an overview of Reformation. In subsequent interactions that I will have with you, we will take up in details specific personalities or issues or regions or even the variants of Reformation. As we will see in the course of our discussion, there were various variants of Reformation. Some even some historians even talk of the counter-reformation as part of the Reformation, because as a consequence or in response to the efforts to reform the Catholic Church, there were simultaneous kind of attempts to bring about some changes, reforms in the Catholic Church as well. So, what essentially we intend to portray here as part of Reformation is that there are various shades of Reformation, and of course, there are several personalities associated with it. Most of us have heard of Calvin, we have heard of Martin Luther, we have heard of Zwingli and so forth. So, they were active in different regions of Europe around the same time, around 16th century, and we shall see as to what their contributions are and so forth. But today, as part of our discussion, we would be trying to understand as to what do we mean by Reformation. And as you can see on your slide, Reformation pertains to a specific movement to reform the church in Western Europe. To begin with, it started say in Germany, spread to several other areas, and it generated a different kind of response. Some of the responses did betray a sense of pattern, whereas some defied the pattern and were kind of very unique in their own ways. For example, England came to have almost a national church, and this was as a consequence of direct political intervention on part of the secular authorities, that is the king. So, Reformation here refers to a specific movement to reform church in Western Europe, and there already was a recognition of the need to drastically overhaul the institutions, several practices and ideas of the Western church. So, it's a wide gamut of segments that were covered as part of Reformation. It was not only about the theological part of it, rather it went on to seek overhaul of the institutions, the practices and also the ideas that underpinned several of these religious practices and so forth. So, when we talk of Reformation, we take into our ambit all these range of institutions, practices and ideas associated with the Western Church. Very importantly, as you can see on your slide, there were social and intellectual dimensions to the movement, and this is something that in this lecture we will try to explore, that it was not only about religion and religiosity. it was not only about the theoretical theological issues underpinning Catholic Church, but it went beyond that. There were several factors that extended beyond religion. For example, there were social groups who kind of you can say lapped on to this situation to leverage their access to the political power at that point of time, or to emerge into prominence. There were political institutions, the kingship itself, the German princes. They almost rode piggyback on the excitement generated by Martin Luther, which almost was a call to greatly reduce the power of the papacy, and this opportunity was lapped on by the princes of Germany. So there is some kind of a symbiotic relation that came to characterize this movement, so far as the princes are German princes were concerned and Martin Luther was concerned. So Martin Luther, by having access to these German princes, got a favorable, you can say, administrative and political environment or support to further his ideas, whereas the princes in return saw this as an opportunity to curtail the power of the Roman Church. And there were several other consequences, essentially political and economic in nature, that went side by side alongside this symbiotic relation between German princes and Martin Luther. So we shall be talking about it. So there are very strong social and intellectual dimensions to this movement, and we shall explore that. By the beginning of the 17th century, as you can see on your slide, the cry for reform in head and members of church had already become prominent, and as you can see, I've used this phrase reform in head and members. That means it is not only restricted to the high echelons of Christian church or Catholic church, rather it percolated to the members down below, to the lower bureaucracy of Catholic Church as well. So it's very institutional in nature as well. The overhaul that I just spoke of in the previous slide, it sought to bring about some real changes in the very structure of Christendom as such. Even the lower bureaucracy was touched upon. Church's legal system, and that goes on to show the extent of, or you can say the scope of Reformation. So church's legal system also was touched upon, was in fact it was realized that they also needed to be completely overhauled. Ecclesiastical bureaucracy was widely perceived by 16th century as inefficient and corrupt, and there are some antecedents and historians speak about it. It's not as if it is only through Martin Luther or it is only through the 16th century reformers that for the first time Christian church or Catholic Church was experiencing this kind of voice for protest or voice for bringing about change in Christendom. But there were antecedents. There were leaders who had spoken about it to bring about changes in the practices and religiosity of Catholic Church before as well, in the 13th and 14th centuries as well. We will talk about it, but there is no kind of umbilical cord connecting the two. So while the earlier you can say voices of reform was very restricted in nature. It was mostly theological, and it had to do with the detailing of some sacraments and so forth, or some of the ideas that underpinned Catholic Church and so forth, but it didn't quite have the political, economic and social trappings that 16th century Europe had, and that goes on to accord a lot of importance to what was happening as part of Reformation in 16th century. So the point that we are making is that it is not only the academic, religious or theological details of some idea within Christendom or Christianity that are important. Rather, it is the you can say tentacles of politics. It is the tentacles of society. It is the tentacles of economy that was also impacting and enmeshed with what was happening as part of Reformation in 16th century, and therefore 16th century efforts to reform this Catholic Church assumes importance and distinction as compared to the earlier efforts, and we shall be talking about it. As is very evident, the morals of the clergy had become very lax, even scandalous. We had practices like absenteeism. Ecclesiastical posts were obtained through dubious means, and when I say this, it is I am referring perhaps to the sale of indulgence that you must have heard of, and we shall elaborate as to what it exactly meant. Then Pope Alexander VI's election in 1492 to the papacy was virtually bought. It was not on account of any religion and religiosity that he was elevated to the position of becoming a pope. Rather, it was bought. He became pope by buying this position, and so far as his own credentials for the position are concerned, we know that he had several mistresses and even children. So that tells you the story of you can say corruption and how scandalous this clergy had become by around 15th and 16th centuries, and people were gradually becoming aware of it. It was for someone to weave all these sense of discontentment into a very focused approach to reform, and that is what these reformers seem to be doing. Then, as I said, that when we talk of Reformation, we should not get stuck in only the theological restricted corridor of reforms. Rather, there were people from amongst the society, or there were sections of people who had been clamoring for legal and administrative and moral reformation of church. So it was very much beyond the narrow corridor of religion and theology. The intelligentsia, and we all know that Renaissance had already happened in Europe, or was simultaneously simultaneously unfolding as part of cultural reawakening, and intelligentsia were emphasizing the need to recapture the vitality and freshness of the Christian faith. So there is that kind of a cry, or you can say desire to restore Christianity to its pristine pure form. That is towards the first 4 or 5 decades of the origin of Christianity. So that familiar theme in Renaissance that we come across, where the Middle Ages are deliberately projected as dark ages, as the source from where most of the corrupt practices had creeped into religion and religious practices. So that is something that reverberates even in the case of Reformation. And we find that Renaissance intelligentsia is talking of recapturing the vitality and freshness of Christian faith, as if whatever ills and corruption or deviations that had come in Christian faith were a consequence of the medieval times, of the dark ages, right. So there is that element of you can say golden age conceptualization of Christianity, and the need to recapture that and recreate that kind of a situation for 16th century European society as well. Yet, despite all these clamorings and so forth, we find that the Pope still showed more interest in secular than spiritual matters. Again, I will come back to this because this has some pertinence to a very important conceptualization or idea underpinning Catholic Christianity till around this point of time, the idea related to justification by faith and faith alone and so forth. We will come back to that. So the Pope is still interested more in secular rather than spiritual matters, and managed between them to achieve avarice, power politics and so forth. So that tells you about the corruption that had crept into Catholic Christianity, and more than spiritual matters, it is the secular mundane matters that the Pope got interested in. And that is why the princes, the kings who are basically looking after the mundane affairs of the state are resisting it. They want the Pope's power to be curtailed so that they get more kind of scope to expand and intensify their power, their political power. And therefore, you do well to remember that 16th century is also the time, and particularly 17th century is also the time when in Europe, across regions, you find emergence of absolutist states. So all the kings who are aspiring to expand and intensify the domain of political control of their power are finding the reformist movements very handy, and at its behest their purpose is getting solved, and that is the church is coming under major critique, under pressure, and that allows the secular authorities or kings to grab more and more power under themselves, or to bring more and more ambit of governance under their control. And therefore, they rather welcomed this. They are very supportive of this, and this is best exemplified through the example of a symbiotic relation between what Martin Luther was doing in Germany and what German princes were doing to him. So that is about legal and administrative. Alongside that, we have another section in 16th century society, European society, that demanded recognition of Christian doctrine, of theology, of religious ideas. So there were people who were backing this on account of religious concern, genuine religious concern about ideas and so forth. So we have a number of tangents that come together, that coalesce to give significance and force to Reformation. For the likes of Luther at Wittenberg and Calvin, who was more active in areas around Geneva, the sad state of the church in the 16th century was simply a symptom of a more radical disease, and that was a deviation from the distinctive ideas of Christian faith, a loss of intellectual identity, a failure to grasp what Christianity really was. So, this tells you about what I was just telling you moments earlier, that there is that sense of reclaiming the pristine, glorious past of the first 3-4 centuries of the origin of Christianity, and do away with the ills and abuses that had crept in during the Middle Ages. So, there is an appeal to reclaim the ideas of the golden age of Christian church. As I told you, implicit was the recognition of corruption of Christian doctrine and ethics through the Middle Ages. Thus, the reformers by and large are echoing the cry of the humanists, and that is back to the sources, and that establishes the connection between the reformers and the Renaissance intelligentsia or humanists. So, there is that you can say commonality of purpose that you can see in terms of trying to go back to the sources in its pristine original form. A famous historian who has commented on Reformation, Alistair E. McGrath, he says that Reformation could have resulted as much from the growing levels of expectation, that is, and this growing level of expectation perhaps is on account of an exemplary growth of an educated laity who, through increasing educational opportunities, were now in a position to criticize the church as well. There is printing press that is gaining currency and it is becoming popular. So, pamphlets are getting published, intelligentsia across regions are coming into contact with each other. They could communicate nuanced academic ideas. So, there is a multiplicity of factors at play, which is giving a lot of push to reformist efforts, and all these expectations of the educated laity of some kind of a change from the late medieval church was almost matched by the declining levels of performance by the church as well. So, on the one hand, there are abuses, there are corruptions entering the performance of church, and there is a simultaneous increase in the expectation of a new class of intelligentsia, educated people as well. Now, the question is, who could be the candidates who could reform the church? Now, when we look at this question, then we find that the power of the Pope had significantly diminished by the beginning of 16th century, with a correspondingly opposite rise in the power of secular authorities. I have already alluded to this in terms of the connection between absolutism and Reformation. For example, in 1478, you have the Spanish Inquisition, where the king's power over clergy, religious orders, bishops was very much established. In 1516, there is Concordat of Bologna, where the French king got the right to appoint senior clergy of French church and also could control its finances. All these things tell you about some kind of a preface where the secular authority is asserting its power over church. Hence, the reformers or the Protestants allied themselves with regional or civic powers to effect their program of reform. As I just told you, that Luther appealed to the German nobility, whereas Zwingli appealed to the Zurich City Council. So, there is some kind of a symbiotic relationship at display between governments of the day and these reformers. English Reformation, I told you, was atypical because Henry VIII imposed Reformation upon his church as a naked act of state. Again, a very good you can say specimen of what absolutist states were, and therefore a kind of symbiotic alliance of reformers and the state or the civic authorities in terms of the reformer, or for that matter, Luther kept calling these German princes as godly prince, and that helped their cause, because it allowed them to contain any sense of rancor or revolt in these subjects. So, in that sense, Luther was very conservative, and it helped the cause of the German princes in terms of establishing control over their subject population. The opponents of Reformation wanted the status quo between religion and state, and that is very commonsensically understood. So, the political and social dimension of Reformation is something which prominently comes out. Secular authorities in Northern Europe saw their chance to seize power from church, even by committing to a new religious order, that is Lutheranism, and that establishes as to how the social and political connections of Reformation was very much there, alongside the religion and religiosity and theological aspects that underpinned the movement of Reformation in 16th century Europe. Thank you.